Is Jeka Saragih UFC ready? Well, we're about to find out, aren't we? Because he's going to be fighting Lucas Alexander this Saturday in Las Vegas. Now, by now, you probably know the story. He was supposed to fight Jesse Butler. Butler got injured. Then he was going to fight Charlie Campbell. That fight was canceled. So now, a few weeks in advance, he got scheduled to fight Lucas Alexander of Brazil. Alexander is 1-1 in the UFC, first fighting against Joanderson Brito and losing that fight by standing rear naked choke in the first round. Then after that, he fought Steven Peterson and won by unanimous decision. Jeka, on the other hand, stormed through Road to UFC to the finals and then fell to Anshul Jubli by second round ground and pound TKO. Honestly, a lot is riding on this fight, and you have to almost see Jeka Saragih almost like an investment from the UFC into the Indonesian market, as he's the only fighter in the UFC from Indonesia and is extremely popular. In fact, he's a lot more popular than most ranked UFC fighters. The problem is that he's yet to actually fight and win in the UFC. So the UFC really wants to handle this delicately and give him fights that he can win, at least in the beginning. So is Lucas Alexander the opponent that he's going to be able to beat? So in this video, I'm going to take a look at that and see how Jeka matches up against Alexander. Alexander is a really tough opponent, and honestly maybe the toughest of the three opponents that Jeka has gone through before fighting this Saturday. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, would really appreciate that. So let's get into the fight. So Jeka is one of those fighters that is a little bit hard to break down just because he changes so much in between each fight, and he's still really raw in a lot of ways. At the same time, he's really unpredictable because he has such huge knockout power. In his road UFC fights, we saw him get much better in between each fight. And for the last year or so, he's been training down in San Diego at Graham Boylan's MMA Academy with a lot of other Indonesian fighters and fighters from all around the world. So the question is, how much better has Jeka gotten since fighting Anshul Jubli last February? That's going to be a big mystery, but honestly, we can just go off of what we've seen from Jeka. So in his first road UFC fight, he fought Pawan Singh, and that fight he took on short notice. That was at lightweight, where he's dropping down to featherweight to fight Lucas Alexander. But that was also kind of a hard fight to judge how good his skill is because he took it on short notice, and also because Pawan was really the best Indian fighter, but I wouldn't necessarily say up to the high standards of the UFC. So honestly, and this is no offense to either guy, but at that time the skill was relatively low in that fight. He was able to knock out Pawan with a spinning back fist in the third round, but the real surprise was when he fought Kim Kyung-pyo in the second round of the Road to UFC tournament. He surprised everyone by knocking out Kim in the first round. As I watched through all of the Road to UFC and UFC Fight that Jeka has already fought in, what I saw from Jeka is that a lot of times he starts the fight massively out of range with his punches. He throws incredible power, sometimes out of range, but what you'll notice is as the fight goes on, he gets gradually closer and closer to hitting the mark, and that's exactly what happened against Kim Kyung-pyo. He eventually found the mark and was able to knock him out. He throws a lot of home run strikes, and a lot of times that can leave him open for the counters. So against a guy like Alexander, Jeka needs to keep things tight and make sure that he doesn't leave himself wildly out of position, because Lucas Alexander is a really good tactician and very technical. He is going to exploit those openings, no doubt, against Jeka. But the thing with Jeka is that he is not afraid of a firefight. Whenever people are aggressive and push the pace towards him, he's going to meet fire with fire and fight right back with that aggression. So that's a really big strength of Jeka, is that when he's pressured, he does not wilt, he does not fall back, but he's going to push back, and most of the time, he's going to have the greater power of two fighters. Now, when we're talking about takedown ability of Jeka Saragih, sometimes he can opt to use just brute strength to get people to the ground over the finer points of wrestling. I know that he has been working on his wrestling, so I would expect that to be better than what he showed in Road to UFC, but still sometimes he can just rely on his strength, which honestly is not good for the gas tank over the long haul. When Jeka hits the mat, really all I've seen from him is his top game, which he has a lot of offense that he throws up there, extremely powerful, but sometimes a little bit plodding and not always very articulate it with his transitions. So against Lucas Alexander, I might say you want to avoid the ground against the Brazilian. So for Lucas Alexander, I'm going off of the first 2 UFC fights of his career. In his first fight, we really didn't get to see much from him because he slipped throwing a head kick pretty early into the fight, which gave up his back, and Joanderson Brito, a very good grappler, took his back and hung on his back in the standing position where he was eventually able to get the choke. In his second fight against Steven Peterson, where he had a full training camp, he looked much better and really got a lot of praise from a lot of media members and critics. He showed a very technical and tight game where he showed off his Muay Thai striking. He often operates in a switch stance and uses a Muay Thai base for his strikes. The thing with Alexander that you have to watch is the leg kicks. He is absolutely brutal and often will even use the punches to set up the low kicks. He absolutely tore Steven Peterson's leg to shreds, and that was maybe the most effective weapon in this fight. So for Jeka Saragih, he's got to be careful for those. Now, although Lucas Alexander has really good kicks, he hasn't necessarily, at least what I've seen in his UFC fights, been able to match the same kind of devastating power with his punches. He doesn't really throw a jab very often and doesn't have that same sort of whip that he throws with the punches as he does with his leg kicks. He does have really fast hands and is really good at countering strikes with a lot of consistency. So that's another thing that Jeka needs to watch for. Most of his punching combinations are counter punches rather than leading or initiating combinations. And to me, when I look at Lucas Alexander, he kind of looks like a very young, little bit more raw Edson Barbosa. He really has that kind of all action, very Muay Thai heavy style to him that I think over time he's going to develop into a really good UFC fighter. And I wouldn't be surprised if one day we could see a number by his name. He moved so well against Steven Peterson, and Peterson honestly fell for all of his traps and started to get really frustrated and started to chase him. And at that point, Almeida was just tagging him with counters all night long. And that's why I think this fight is a lot tougher for Jeka Saragih in a lot of ways, more tough than maybe Campbell or Jesse Butler might have been. So honestly, I think this is a pretty tough fight for Jeka Saragih to fight in the UFC. I am glad that of all the places and circumstances that Jeka could have fought under, I'm glad that he is fighting on the prelims of a UFC Fight Night card in the UFC Apex, because Jeka, training out of San Diego, it's just a 4-hour drive over to Las Vegas. He's already fought in the Apex before and Road to UFC, so he knows how to do that song and dance. It's much more comfortable for him than if he was fighting in a big arena in front of a lot of fans. So hopefully that at least should work in Jeka's favor. If you were to sit me down and force me to make a prediction for this fight, I'd probably say Lucas by first or second round TKO. But I think for Jeka, if he wants to win this fight, the main key to getting Almeida out of there, I would say, is to counter those leg kicks with a powerful straight right. He needs to get Almeida's attention and warn him that he can't just spam those leg kicks all day long. For Jeka, his best hope may be to hit that home run shot when Almeida's throwing out a lot of these leg kicks. Jeka has shown us that he's able to throw a lot of power, not only in a firefight at close range, but also at distance. So he can really tag and damage Almeida really from anywhere in this fight. He's a very tough and resilient fighter and has a lot of strength, but he needs to conserve that strength throughout the whole entirety of the fight. He needs to pick his shots, not get lazy, but I would say try to shoot for the counter striking game. Again, this is a tough fight for Jeka Saragih in the UFC. Honestly, I think if he loses, it's not going to be that big of a deal for him. I think that the UFC will probably rebook him against an even easier opponent. It's a very interesting fight. At the very least, I think it should be very exciting. So look forward to that and enjoy this fight coming up this weekend.